Alabama woman Rachel Camille Calhoun attempted to rob a branch of Regions Bank in the 1300 block of Tomahawk Road in Forestdale shortly before 10 a.m. on June the 6th of 2018. The 24-year-old reportedly handed the manager a note demanding $6,000 in cash from the vault. Calhoun's note indicated that if she received the money without incident, the manager would be rewarded with an intimate favor. If her demand was refused, the young woman said she'd falsely accused the manager of assault. As Calhoun was still waiting for the money inside the branch, deputies from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office arrived and took her into custody. She was charged with first-degree attempted extortion and first-degree attempted theft. Number 7. Donna Sparks and George Davis. The police in Lockland, Ohio, were called to a home on South Wayne Avenue after receiving reports of shots fired on the premises in the early morning hours of May the 10th of 2020. 42-year-old Mohammed Ndiaye was found dead in front of his house, having suffered apparent gunshot wounds. Following an investigation into the matter, law enforcement arrested Donna Sparks, an escort and paid acquaintance of Ndiaye's. The 26-year-old woman had reportedly been at the house prior to the outbreak of gunfire and had been planning to rob the victim with an accomplice, George Davis, aged 32. Shortly before the botched robbery turned shooting, Sparks sent Davis a text message indicating the victim had a firearm. Both suspects were booked at the Hamilton County Justice Center while awaiting trial for murder. Sparks ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter and armed robbery charges, for which she received a 6-year prison sentence. Meanwhile, Davis, the one who gunned down both Ndiaye and his dog, was found guilty of felony murder, felonious assault, aggravated robbery, and a weapons offense. He was consequently handed down a prison sentence of 25 years to life. Number 6. Mermaid Waters robbery. A man from Mermaid Waters, a suburb of the Australian city of Gold Coast, rushed home on the afternoon of August the 23rd of 2022 after receiving an alert that his home security alarm had been triggered. Upon arrival, the man encountered a trio of teens who'd broken into his house, one of whom was armed with a knife and making threats. One of the suspects, a 16-year-old female, got behind the wheel of a stolen Hyundai and tried to flee, but the homeowner's 70-year-old stepfather ran outside and attempted to block her path out of the driveway. She subsequently struck the elderly man and sped off, leaving her 2 accomplices, both identified as teenage males, behind. The stepfather needed to be hospitalized for the injuries he sustained in the collision, which was captured on surveillance footage. Meanwhile, the 2 teen boys were arrested on charges of armed robbery in company and unlawful use of a motor vehicle. The older suspect, an 18-year-old, also faced a count of possessing a knife in public. In the incident's immediate aftermath, law enforcement indicated they knew who the female suspect was and would be seeking to bring her into custody as well. Number 5. BLAYDE Patterson. In January of 2018, a drug-addicted man from New South Wales, Australia, entered a 7-Eleven in Berkeley, a suburb of Wollongong, with the intention of carrying out a robbery. As shown in CCTV footage that later went viral, the suspect, identified as BLAYDE Patterson, was allowed into the store through its secured doors, then tried to hold the place up, threatening the attendant with a knife. The employee, who was protected by a layer of stainless steel wiring, retreated into the back office and locked the door, leaving Patterson alone in the store. The suspect subsequently tried to leave, only to realize that the doors had locked and he was trapped inside. For the next 10 minutes, Patterson frantically tried to find a way out, at one point attempting to gain access to the roof, to no avail. When police arrived, they ordered him onto the ground and took him into custody. His knife was reportedly found in a trash bin inside the store. Patterson later said he'd been so high at the time of the robbery he didn't even remember it. He expressed great remorse for his actions, and a judge delayed his sentencing to allow him to continue with an intensive rehabilitation program. Number 4. George Kinnear. 63-year-old Roseanne Gibson was working in a newsagent with her nephew when a man with a hammer attempted to rob them one day in December of 2021. As the balaclava-clad suspect demanded the Glasgow store's cash, Gibson's nephew leapt over the counter and tackled him to the ground. The woman then rushed over to assist and immediately unmasked the robber, whom she recognized as a previous customer. CCTV caught the dramatic confrontation, which culminated with Gibson and her nephew, 26-year-old Christopher Brown, pinning the suspect to the ground and holding him until the arrival of law enforcement. In the aftermath of the botched robbery, police identified the would-be thief as George Kinnear, an armed forces veteran. The man admitted attempted robbery and threatened violence at Glasgow Crown Court. When footage of the incident circulated online, Gibson, a grandmother, was widely lauded for her efforts to stop the armed criminal, as was her nephew. In September of 2022, 45-year-old Kinnear was jailed for 30 months as a consequence for the crime. Number 3. CIERRA Barber and GARRETT Gage. A violent home invasion unfolded in the 1900 block of South 16th Street in Waco, Texas, on February the 3rd of 2015. According to the resulting arrest affidavit, 20-year-old CIERRA Barber drove 2 associates to the apartment in question to carry out a robbery. Subsequent reports indicated that drugs had been the criminals' target that night when the 2 armed suspects, identified as Garrett Gage and Keith William McClure, entered the residence. They encountered a total of 8 people inside. One of the residents grabbed a rifle and opened fire on the suspects, who promptly fled. McClure was struck by a bullet as he tried to leave. So too was one of the home's occupants, 20-year-old Braden Freeman, who was caught in the line of fire. McClure collapsed in the parking lot and later succumbed to his gunshot wounds, as did Freeman. Gage was arrested when police caught up with him several blocks away from the apartment. Barber, who'd stayed in the car during the course of the home invasion, was also taken into police custody. At the onset of the investigation, authorities believed that McClure had fired the shots that killed Freeman, but it was later concluded that both the victims and McClure's wounds had been inflicted by the resident with the rifle, identified as Chance Heffelfinger. The latter wasn't charged for either man's death, however, as it was determined he'd been acting in self-defense. Initially, Barber and Gage were facing capital murder charges for the bungled robbery attempt. In May of 2017, they pleaded guilty to lesser charges of aggravated robbery, for which Barber was sentenced to 30 years in state prison and Gage was sentenced to 40 years. Today's topic was requested by JS and Chris P. Souls. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Oak Park Home Invasion. On the night of April the 1st of 2022, California man Sal Mercado returned to his Oak Park home to find a car he didn't recognize parked out front. As Mercado later told the press, he encountered a pair of male burglars upon entering the house. One of the suspects managed to flee and escape in the waiting vehicle, while the other, identified as Alexis Provost Aranguiz, was forced to endure the home owner's wrath alone. As Aranguiz made his way down the stairs with handfuls of jewelry and electronics, Mercado unleashed a major beatdown on him. While law enforcement later described the incident as a physical confrontation between the 2 men, Aranguiz's resulting mugshot displayed the full extent of the severe facial injuries Mercado had inflicted. The burglar was charged with felony conspiracy and first-degree residential burglary, with the special allegation that the burglary was a violent crime. Aranguiz, a Chilean national, was believed to be a member of a South American theft group known for sending burglars to the US to steal from citizens and then return to their home countries, in a trend investigators called crime tourism. The suspect, whose accomplices successfully escaped, pleaded not guilty to his crimes and was held in custody on a $150,000 bond. We have more similar cases lined up for you from our previous release on When ATMs Go Wrong. Stay tuned after number 1 if you'd like. Number 1. Quentel LeKelvrick Moultrie and Taylor Manjares. At around 4:30 p.m. on December the 29th of 2021, 3 individuals met at Ralph Carter Park next to Rimfire Elementary in Palm Coast, Florida, to negotiate a drug deal. Quentel LeKelvrick Moultrie and Taylor Renee Manjares were reportedly discussing the potential transaction with a 26-year-old man identified as Daniel G.M. Eventually, Moultrie and Manjares accompanied the latter back to his parents' house on Regent Lane, which was less than a mile away from the park. Manjares entered the residence to use the bathroom, and while she was inside, Danielle reportedly flashed a large sum of cash in front of her. She subsequently left with Moultrie, who continued negotiating with Danielle via text over the course of the evening. Shortly after 9 p.m., Moultrie and Manjades picked up 23-year-old Zaire Roberts, who'd been released from prison 3 months earlier after serving 7 years for a shooting that occurred in 2015. The trio went back to the Regent Lane home, which they planned to rob. Manjades called Danielle from the car outside in an attempt to distract him as Moultrie and Roberts entered the house armed with guns. They ambushed Danielle, who grabbed a Glock firearm from his sock drawer, leading to an exchange of fire. The resident was struck in the hip and leg but managed to incapacitate Roberts, prompting Moultrie to flee. The latter fired a round at the house before speeding off with Manjades. Danielle called 911, telling the dispatcher he'd been robbed and shot. While he ultimately survived the ordeal, Roberts wasn't so lucky. He succumbed to his gunshot wounds, and the following day Manjades was arrested after a traffic stop. Both she and Moultrie, who was likewise taken into custody, were forced to face the legal consequences for their accomplice's death, even though they hadn't been the ones to inflict his fatal wounds. They were charged with second-degree murder and armed burglary. In January of 2023, Moultrie was sentenced to 10 years in prison in connection with an unrelated assault. But as of that development, the murder case was still pending.
Number 8. 2013 UK ATM heists. Throughout 2013, a British gang perpetrated a series of robberies that involved blowing up ATMs to get to the cash inside, marking the first time that such tactics have been used in the UK. The men carried out an estimated 30 attacks, targeting ATMs at banks, mostly in rural areas. In the northwestern Midlands of England, they'd used crowbars to pry open the machines and then inserted a tube through which they released a mixture of oxygen and acetylene, which was then sparked. The powerful explosions also damaged the buildings, but fortunately, no one was hurt. After the blast, the gang would force their way into the bank itself and retrieve the cash before driving off in high-performance cars, which were clocked in at speeds of up to 190 miles per hour. Some of the raids were captured by surveillance footage, but the getaway vehicles had cloned plates, which is why the authorities faced difficulty in tracking them. The gang, whose heists were compared by the media to those in the Fast and Furious franchise, stole over $1 million, while also causing a nearly equivalent amount in damages. After an investigation lasting close to a year, the police were ultimately able to locate their safe house through a tracker that had been fitted to the cash box from one of the machines. As the case unfolded, the authorities retrieved some of the materials which the gang had used, including a stolen and resprayed Audi, and also found abundant forensic evidence. Roughly a dozen men were arrested in the aftermath and charged with conspiracy to cause explosions and conspiracy to commit burglary, for which they were given sentences ranging from 13 to 19 years. In March of 2014, Kurt Beddoes and Craig Cartwright, both in their 30s, admitted to their roles as ringleaders of an operation that would inspire other similar heists in the UK. They were each sentenced to 17 years in prison. The most recent arrest related to the case was Adam Murphy, apprehended in February of 2021, and subsequently handed down a sentence of 15 years. Number 7. Charles Omar McGee. Within moments of making a withdrawal from an ATM in May of 2017, a Tampa woman was robbed. On the first of the month, the victim, whose identity wasn't released, had the cash in hand after taking out of the machine at Amscott Financial on Florida Avenue at around 1:40 a.m. A man who would later be identified as 43-year-old Charles Omar McGee had been standing behind her and waited until she completed the transaction. McGee then lunged in and grabbed the money out of the woman's hand. She desperately tried holding onto it and nearly fell when McGee began to overpower her. As shown by security cameras, another woman was at an ATM next to them but didn't intervene. She continued to operate the machine and only stepped back when McGee pushed his victim in her direction. McGee then walked out with the money, but was arrested later that same week after local law enforcement had released the surveillance footage. Number 6. Tamara Sinclair. In late February of 2021, a former Miss Jamaica contestant died from injuries sustained in an attack at an ATM in the Bronx borough of New York City. On February the 11th, Tamara Sinclair, aged 43, was inside a TD Bank vestibule when another woman, later identified as 21-year-old Rain Harney started banging on the glass, asking Sinclair to let her inside. The former beauty queen was frightened by the encounter and refused to do so. She then went across the street to a Bank of America, but Harney went after her. According to Sinclair's younger sister, who wasn't present at the scene, she tried to disengage, telling her pursuer, "I don't know you." A verbal argument ensued that escalated, resulted in Harney and two of her female friends, Frances Morales and Chanel Arroyo, attacking Sinclair. She was punched, kicked, and stomped on. One of the women stole her phone while the other took her wallet and gave it to Harney to rifle through. A security guard reportedly broke up the brutal beating and called the authorities. Sinclair filed a police report on February the 17th and a few days later went to the Montefiore Medical Center complaining of chest and head pain. Doctors told her that the attack had resulted in the formation of dangerous blood clots, but Sinclair refused further treatment as she was worried that she wouldn't be able to cover the cost. After she returned home, Sinclair couldn't eat or sleep and on February the 22nd died in front of her sister. Harney was arrested along with Morales and Arroyo, both in their early 20s, and all three were charged with murder and robbery. Number 5. Ashanti Slater and Isis Wallace. In August of 2020, over the course of a single week, teenagers Ashanti Slater and Isis Wallace robbed people at the same ATM in Edinburgh, Texas, on 2 separate occasions. On August the 24th, an unnamed woman had withdrawn $600 from a Chase Bank ATM. She was approached by a woman believed to have been either Wallace or Slater, who was wearing dark clothing and a black gator-style mask. The robber brandished a silver object, which the victim thought to be a handgun, and she consequently handed over the money. Around the time of the incident, neighborhood surveillance cameras captured a silver Nissan speeding away with its lights off. On August the 30th, at around 11:15, Wallace attacked a woman who'd withdrawn $60 from the same ATM through the driver's side window of her vehicle. The victim's husband got out of the car and chased after Wallace, who ran from the scene and was picked up by Slater. By that time, police had already been searching for 2 African-American females in a silver car in connection to the first robbery. Slater and Wallace, both 18 at the time, were stopped near McCall and University. A search was conducted and an officer found marijuana in their car. Wallace waived her rights and verbally implicated herself to the robbery on the 24th, pointing to Slater as her accomplice. Both were arrested and charged with aggravated robbery, and possession of marijuana. Number 4. ATM explosion kills thief. At the time of the George Floyd protests starting in late May of 2020, dozens of ATMs were blown up, vandalized, or stolen entirely by looters in Philadelphia. The police deemed it an organized and coordinated effort. Outside Blue Jay Restaurant at 29th Street and Girard Avenue in Brewery Town, an ATM was blown up twice in consecutive days. The thieves hadn't been able to get to the cash the first time around, but were successful on the second try, as local law enforcement still struggled to contain the chaos that had gripped the streets. In another case, a burglar suffered fatal injuries after using explosives to try and pry open one of the machines. On June the 2nd, the would-be thief, only identified as a 24-year-old man, placed an improvised bomb in a sidewalk-facing ATM outside a sports bar along North 2nd Street, near Susquehanna Avenue. It's unclear if he'd misjudged the blast radius or hadn't allowed himself enough time to get clear. He was impacted by the explosion and suffered trauma to his upper body. The man was rushed to a nearby hospital but passed away a few hours later. Number 3. James Fairburn and Stuart Penny. Between October of 2017 and February of the following year, James Fairburn and Stuart Penny targeted several ATMs housed at businesses in northeast England. The men, both in their mid-30s, had been connected to 7 attacks in Bradford, Keighley, Huddersfield and Darlington, as well as to 2 cases of auto theft for the vehicles they'd used to carry out the heists. Fairburn and Penny would pump gas into the machines, then triggered explosions that severely damaged the buildings where they were located, which mainly consisted of convenience stores and gas stations. While no one was hurt, the blast frightened communities and economically impacted business owners in the neighborhoods where they occurred. The robbers stole the equivalent of over $400,000. Their last heist was at a store in Bradford where the explosion tore the door and roof off the annex where the ATM was housed. Pieces of brickwork were sent flying into people's gardens. Fairburn and Penny presumably fled in a panic as they abandoned their tools, which consisted of 2 gas canisters hooked to a car battery with tubes that fed into the ATM. The evidence contributed to the investigation, and the police eventually conducted a search of their addresses, where they found hundreds of thousands of pounds in cash and mobile phones. Fairburn and Penny were arrested in February of 2018. They subsequently admitted their guilt at Leeds Crown Court, after which in 2021 they were sentenced to 12 and 14.5 years respectively. Number 2. Anne Nguyen and Joshua Puckett. In 2015, a man and a woman from Frisco, Texas, were taken into custody by local authorities following a robbery and assault that occurred on December the 8th. Anne Nguyen and Joshua Puckett, both in their late 20s, followed an unnamed 38-year-old woman after she'd taken money out of an ATM at a 7-Eleven in 7950 Gaylord Parkway. As she returned to her car in the parking lot of an apartment complex, Nguyen and Puckett attacked her. Puckett struck her multiple times in the head with a dark-colored handgun before the pair made off with her handbag. Both were arrested in the aftermath and charged with aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon, and each held on a $100,000 bond. Number 1. Utrecht Gang. In the fall of 2021, law enforcement in Germany and the Netherlands cooperated to take down a gang that had set up an illegal training facility in Europe, teaching would-be thieves how to blow up ATMs. The criminal operation even involved filming tutorials. The cross-border investigation unfolded over the course of 18 months and culminated in 9 arrests. The suspects had been ordering different ATM models, which were transported to their hideout in Utrecht, the Netherlands, then experimented and tried to find the most effective way to open them. They would then hand the training videos in person to other robbers. In 2020, a test went awry and the main suspect, only identified as a 29-year-old man, was killed in the explosion, while his 24-year-old accomplice sustained serious injuries. The investigation had commenced after police in Osnabrück, Germany, reported suspicious ATM orders from a local company. The gang was subsequently linked to at least 15 cash machine bombings in Germany, from which they made off with nearly $2.5 million. Such attacks have been deemed a growing concern in the country, where, according to the Associated Press, an estimated 414 ATMs were blown up in 2020 alone.
Thanks for watching. Would you rather get robbed while house-sitting for a friend, or deposit cash into an ATM only to realize the machine is a fake? Let us know in the comments section below.